Let's say in like 1950, if you were to ask a normal Russian, what do you think of Ukraine? What would this person most likely say?
Let's go for later after Stalin instead. Like if we skip forward a few years, because then some interesting things happen that give us a bit more insight. But because they probably wouldn't have said anything in 1950 because they'd been
Sure.
terrified.
Sure.
They'd have
Sure.
probably reported you, right? Because
Sure.
you
Yes.
weren't
Gathered
Soviet.
around the dinner table in the privacy of, yeah.
Yeah. So after the death of Stalin, and of course during Khrushchev gives this secret speech where essentially he denounces the cult of personality around Stalin in 1956. But another part of that speech is he also sort of talks about the deportation of nations of different nationalities, and because this happened, for example, the Kalmyks, who are a sort of Buddhist nation. They originally came with the Mongols. A few Kalmyks collaborated with the Nazis during the German occupation of their region. And so the entire nation, including heroes of the Soviet Union, were deported, and their like autonomous republic, or their republic rather, was destroyed. And Khrushchev made a joke, he himself having many links, of course, and roots in Ukraine, that, if we'd applied it equally, this rule would have had to deport half of Ukraine. And so there was always this sense that some Ukrainians, had betrayed the Soviet Union. But of course, it's problematic because what that forgets, because it forgets the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, is that half of Ukraine was only brought into the Soviet Union after 1939. So of course they're not, I mean, I wouldn't use the word traitors about anybody anyway in this particular case, but they weren't really even sort of Soviet citizens, and they did tend to have more national consciousness. And whilst some of the more extreme Ukrainian nationalists certainly did participate in the Holocaust and certainly committed grave crimes, that's not representative of all of the Ukrainian nationalists. Many of them just fought against the Soviets. And I think after the Holodomor, in which between 4 to 8 million Ukrainians died, I think it's reasonable to understand why they may have resisted that rule. But what you have immediately is this sense of, within Russian thinking, that there are two Ukraines. You have your bad Ukrainians who are nationalists, they speak Ukrainian, maybe they wear vishivanki, like the sort of national the beautiful national embroidered shirts. They essentially embrace their Ukrainianness. And then you have good Ukrainians who are essentially little Russians. That's actually a word, malorossianie. And they understand, they speak Russian. Maybe they have a few, funny words of dialect. Maybe they pronounce this letter a bit differently. But they understand that they're Russian, and that's that. And this idea is, I mean, it always kind of existed, but it becomes quite embedded. And what you see is, if we skip forward then to 1991, this comes up again, and within sort of Soviet Ukrainian press, as the Soviet Union is collapsing, this idea that we like Ukraine, Ukrainians are our brothers, they're basically us. If they become sovereign, if they become independent, this is just the victory of those mad Ukrainian nationalists. And you see it again in 2004, and you then, of course, see it again in 2014, and clearly we see it now. And so it's this idea that Ukraine has betrayed Russia. And historically as well, because there's, of course, the Battle of Poltava, where Mazepa switches sides, who was the head of he was the hetman, and he, of the sort of Cossacks, and he switched sides stupidly for him, as it turned out, and supported King Charles of Sweden. And so this comes up a lot. And even now, I was just reading an article the other day, an RT in Russian, talking about Mazepa, and that you have Mazepa's Ukraine versus, I can't remember, but it was, some other sort of Ukrainian who was deemed appropriate. So most Russians, if they talk about Ukrainians, certainly before 2022, even still, it was, of course, we like Ukrainians. They're us. They're our family. You don't understand as a Westerner. I have family here. My granddad was from Ukraine, etc. But it's very complicated. In many ways, it reminds me, as somebody who has Irish family, but it's clearly English, it reminds me of the interlinkages between Ireland and England. But most English people understand that Irish people are not English. At least now we do, anyway. It took a while.